Hello and welcome to the final webinar from the Pioneers in this series on recruitment strategies for scale-ups. Really looking forward to this conversation today. Before we get started, just for those of you that don't know, I'm Bea. I'm one of the co-founders at the Pioneers. The Pioneers was started basically to make people happier at work, and so we love talking about any subject related to that. And today's conversation is kind of, it feels like the topic of the moment after the last 2 years we've had, which is how do we recruit into hybrid and remote working teams? So to help me with that conversation, I have two wonderful guests. I have Michelle from WeFarm and Wendy from The Social Element. Michelle, some of you will recognise, is back from last time. She did such a fantastic job and I know is super passionate on this subject. And Wendy here for the first time, and it's really lovely to have you. Maybe Michelle, if you could just give us a quick introduction to those people that haven't met you, to yourself, and then Wendy, if you go after Michelle.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Michelle. I'm the COO of WeFarm, which is a social enterprise working with agricultural technology, working with small scale farmers, primarily in East Africa at the moment, given where we work and the fact that a lot of our ops is based in the UK, obviously remote before remote was a thing, and gone fully remote in the last couple of years. We have staff now in 9 countries, made the decision at late 2020 that we were never going back to an office. So it's evolved since then.
Cool. Wendy.
Thank you. Hi, Michelle. I'm Wendy Christie. I'm the Chief People Officer at The Social Element, and we're a social media agency who help brands to build human connections with their consumers. I'm based in Aberdeenshire, and we've got people in, should have checked before the call, but it's around 30 countries, so it's sometimes quite hard to keep up. And we've always been remote first. We were hybrid for a while, but now we're pretty much fully remote since the pandemic.
Yeah, and I remember, Wendy, having a conversation with your founder, Tamara, in a podcast a couple of years ago that was all about the reasons for starting remote, and actually then, rather than being forced into it through a pandemic, it was actually about having a lean company and investing in people rather than in a physical office space. So making those choices in the early days has obviously had a consequence for how the business has worked through the following 20 years. So we will explore some of that too. So let's get started on the conversation. I think maybe a good place to start when we're talking about recruitment is that I hesitate to say this because I don't feel like any process has a beginning and a definitive end, but somewhere sort of towards the early stages of a recruitment process, and that's around finding and attracting great candidates. And I guess the big question here is, so what changes when it comes to finding and attracting candidates when the offering, if you like, is a remote one? And let's focus on maybe remote first. How does that change the strategies that you've deployed to find great candidates? Michelle, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for us, it's been a learning curve, obviously, because we had 4 offices pre-pandemic, and the reality is when you start advertising remote, you just get copies of the networks you already have, so they tended to be in the same hubs. Being really strategic about where you post, finding networks for certain things, the right market for the right job, has been a battle. It's an ongoing learning curve. I think the reality is a lot of the tech hasn't caught up too, so you'll know, anybody who's posting jobs knows that you have to pick a city in LinkedIn before you can click the remote tag. But it's not really remote. It's still going to advertise it to the people in the same city. So being really thoughtful, and I mean, Wendy and I were talking about this the other day of like you post the same job in many cities and see what's out there. So it's a lot of trial and error and learning where, for you, like for us, we have specific code bases and stuff that tend to have markets in certain areas. So being really strategic about tackling them in the right place.
And can I, maybe a really practical thing, but if you are posting that same job into multiple locations, how do you actually manage the responses to that? Because presumably that means you've got people effectively applying to different jobs. So from just a process management, how have you handled that?
I mean, for us, we tend to, a lot of our jobs require certain language sets, which means we tend to do a primary one first. Swahili is only going to be in so many markets versus other things. So we tend to advertise in one place. If we find we're not getting the candidates we're looking for or the diversity, then we'll go elsewhere. But I tend to have one pipeline and just change the city versus having, in my previous job, we would have the same job posted in 6 cities, and it was literally like having 6 job postings up. There was no good way to manage it. I don't really have a good answer to that.
No, I don't think I mean, we use an applicant tracking system, and I think we can roll up different applications into one job, but I must admit I'm not the one doing that every day. So I'm just now thinking, oh my gosh, are my team going absolutely mad with all of this process? And in terms of one of the things that changes when it's remote is that you have access to people you just simply wouldn't have access to. So if you were thinking, okay, well, I'm thinking, within 50 miles or so of London or whatever, there may be super talented people all over the country or in different countries for whom it would be impossible to get to that workplace, either because they live in a whole different city or because they may have caring responsibilities or a disability that may make traveling to that location in a normal working day pretty difficult. So I think it just opens up the talent pool, and it gives people opportunities who might not have them otherwise. And in terms of where to advertise, we share exactly the same pain as Michelle, with the technology not catching up, but also as well as LinkedIn and as well as the sort of traditional job ad places, there are many Facebook groups and specific hashtags that it's worth including, like remote work and remote jobs, university groups, groups that are there for particular, you might have LGBTQ plus community groups or ethnic minority groups that you can sort of reach out to try and increase the diversity of the people who are seeing your ads as well. But then of course you've got your own networks and your own teams, and really sort of encouraging people to share and get the job out as much as possible.
I feel like we are informing product development for some of the recruitment tech out there.
Something I never thought I'd hear anyone say.
I've had that conversation with our LinkedIn person. They've been telling us it's coming for about 1.5 years. So
okay. And Michelle, you kind of touched on this, but in terms of knowing where certain skill sets are in particular markets, how have you found those talent pools? Has it been a bit of Googling and where do you get that knowledge from of, actually, this is a remote job, it could be done from anywhere in the world, we want to find the best talent for that job? How do you acquire that knowledge?
So I think part of it is just the groups, right? When he was talking about the networks and the communities, a lot of those are, if not global, like European or East African, or like they will cross boundaries because they're digital networks. They're not live communities where they're meeting in person in London. So those things have expanded a lot. So working through networks, posting in those groups, a lot of our team members, like we wrote in ClojureScript, which is very niche functional language. You can do a search on LinkedIn and Recruiter and see where they are. And most of them are in Europe or Silicon Valley. So, and that's too far the other direction for us. So you can target certain areas. And the reality is, especially for niche roles like that, people will apply even if it's not local. Like it was posted in London, but we had somebody apply from very remote, like lives on an island off of Denmark. And he's now part of the team. But because those slightly more niche roles, they'll come to you and then you'll discover new talent. Like it's a constant evolution of, okay, what networks are you in? And we hired our first developer in Nigeria because he applied to a job that was posted in East Africa. Great. And so asking him, okay, what are the networks you're in? And how do we then get into those and continually expanding your network? Because initially it was London, Nairobi, and we had these two little worlds, and how do we bridge some of those gaps? So yeah, talking to people, asking those questions. Where would you go? Every time I travel, every time we hire somebody, where would you go? Where did you find this job? Yeah.
And Wendy, you're nodding along like, yeah, absolutely. These are the same sorts of tactics that we've deployed.
Yeah, kind of. And we've got, we're really lucky. We work with a fantastic languages consultant called Richard Simcott, who's a bit of a celebrity in the polyglot world. And every year he holds a big conference. Of the last couple of years, it's been online, but he's going back to in person, I think, this year, where hundreds of people come along from all over the world. And he is absolutely brilliant at maintaining these networks, which is super helpful for us if we're looking for people either with a particular language or cultural knowledge of a particular territory where one of our clients might have consumers. So it's really all about the networking.
Yeah. Have either of you done anything around access, like deliberately accessing cheaper markets? I know it might be a slightly taboo topic, but does that come up in conversations, and has that ever been something that you've sort of proactively thought about? Maybe Wendy, do you want to?
I go.
Yeah.
Yeah, we sort of haven't deliberately sought to go into cheaper markets or to go into a market because it's cheaper. We have ended up in cheaper markets because through the networking thing, you know, I know a guy in the Dominican Republic, for example, who speaks this language and knows about this culture, and then we kind of end up growing a hub in those territories because we get referrals from people that they know as well. I would say that I think BPOs have, it feels like they're becoming less of a kind of dirty word, if you like, you know, and I think we're sort of hearing, you know, real quality improvements. And so although it's something that we haven't deliberately sought to do, is to go into these cheaper territories, I think it would always be in our minds to look at. I mean, we want to make sure that even if we are in a cheaper territory, that we are competitive in that territory.
Yeah, so maybe to build on that, we talked about this the other day, and I think this is a really interesting conversation, which is around sort of how do you sort of starting to talk now about attracting candidates, not just finding them, and how do you decide what's fair pay for within your company and in the different markets that you now employ talent in? Michelle, yeah, what's been WeFarm's policy or approach to pay when people are working across different markets?
Because we were in multiple markets before, we always had localized pay, but we pay well to those markets. So often we are working in especially in Kenya, for example, the team is actually working in fairly rural communities. They don't mostly live in Nairobi, but we pay to Nairobi rates because that is where the talent would be found otherwise, right? Like best in class, but localized, because it would be illogical to pay UK rates. Like it wouldn't make sense. But since we've gone fully remote, been really conscious about leveling the benefits so that everybody globally gets the same experience and has the best option of all the countries we work in, basically. So whoever has the best healthcare benefits, we've leveled them all to the same thing, and made parental leave and all those things universal as well. That's obviously complicated on the business side because some governments cover bits of it and some don't, but we've decided that the employee experience needed to be the same regardless of what country they were in. And for most places, that means we are far and above what would be expected locally, in terms of pension rates and paternity leave and all those sorts of things as well.
I was going to say, maybe just to bring a bit of colour to that, do you have if you don't mind sharing, if you've got an example of where you've seen the greatest degree of difference that having an approach like that to equalize the benefits what's been the kind of hardest maybe to implement?
I mean, parental leave is obviously the biggest discrepancy. If you think, even having worked in North America before, like in the US, there is no such thing unless you're in New York. There is no paid leave. Your job is only guaranteed for 2 weeks. In my previous business, we gave them the same that you would get in the UK, and the company just paid the difference. That's significant if you're working in that market. Kenya is similar. Their job is secured in a way, but there is no government subsidy for parental leave. Well, there's no government subsidy for maternity leave. There's absolutely nothing for paternity leave or any other like adoption leave, etc. And we've made it standardized across the board. Everybody gets it, which just means it costs more to the business, but you bear that burden, fine. The other thing that we've done that's been very high uptake and probably the most difficult to manage is the work from anywhere. because everybody is contracted on payroll to a certain country, but they bounce around a lot. And theoretically, that's great, but you always have to check the tax rolls, and it depends what visa they have and what passport they have and where they're going. So it's a one-off every time you do it. So that's probably the benefit we talk about the most, because we're always adapting.
Yeah, that sounds like you need good admin.
I feel the parental leave pain. And again, the example was North America. We work with a PEO to employ our people in the States, and it was one of our team when I think it was our first maternity leave since we'd gone down the full employee route in North America, and it was so hard to give her paid leave. You know, the PEO they just could not get their heads around why we wanted to do this. and you know, but if you do this, then that means her short-term disability benefit will be, she won't be eligible for that anymore. And if you do this and this and this, and that, you know, finally we nailed it. It was ridiculously complicated. We were able to pay her decent maternity leave. And then we thought, right, nailed it. It's complex, but we know what to do now. Then our next maternity leave was someone in a different state, and it was all different again, you know, because they were state benefits that they would be at risk if we, you know, and so, yeah, hugely, we've got a similar approach there, Michelle. We want the experience of working at the agency to you know, we want, you know, we have our culture. We want people to be sort of living and existing in that culture and feeling the same benefits, or, you know, although I guess with legal requirements some of it might be different, but it's hard.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that message is coming through really strongly from both of you about this consistency of employee experience, or fairness in the employee experience that people you want people to expect from WeFarm and from the social element, and sometimes that means in order to deliver that, you actually need to implement quite individual approaches to delivering a consistent employee experience. So I think some people might try to solve some of these challenges by having like a single policy or a single approach to their employee experience, but actually you need those values to be consistent, and the practical implementation has to be done almost at a one-to-one level in certain cases. Just recognizing the difference between a consistent experience and a consistent process.
And I think, you know, that's a really good PEO will do all the things that they're there to do, like make sure that your contractor will probably protect you from litigation, you know, all of the stuff there. But a really great PEO will be totally on board with your culture and your values and find ways to work with you so that you can do the great maternity policy, not try and persuade you that you shouldn't. We're with a different company now.
Okay, so moving on then maybe to later part of recruitment and how we assess candidates. And I guess first question to get that started, again, we will come on to talk about hybrid in a bit, but just focusing on remote for the moment. How do you assess candidates remotely? Obviously, that is a different experience for many. So, Wendy, what's been your approach to remote assessment?
To an extent, it kind of depends on the role, but what every role would have in common would be the video calls, and you know, for some roles there'll be sort of assessment, you know, questionnaire type things. There might be scenarios that we would give them to say, you know, if this happened, how would you then respond to that? Depend on the role, we might ask them to prepare and then present to a panel. If they're, you know, if they're going to be in a client-facing role, for example, we need to know that they're going to be confident doing that kind of thing. I think that probably about covers what we do remotely.
And Michelle, you made a really interesting point about assessment and consistency. The consistency point again. So yeah, maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, I think the the thing you get caught in, and for us, we're remote first. So we have co-working spaces. We don't have anything that's WeForm branded, but we create space for people to get out of the house if they need to. That means that there's always a temptation to try to meet people. Oh, you're near me, so I'll meet you in person. You can't do that in interviews. The experience has to be the same. If you're interviewing everybody else over Zoom, they all have to be on Zoom. For some of our roles, because they're sales roles and have to be in certain markets, fine, do them all in person, but whatever you have done for that role, they all have to be the same, because everybody needs to get the same experience. Otherwise, you're inherently putting bias in the fact that you were face-to-face with someone. And I think the other thing that we've spent a lot of time talking about with all of our interview panels is the cultural inclusivity. Like, you're hiring for, in markets you probably don't know, the cultural expectations will be different. Really focusing on what is important to the role, and we write very actionable, like, bullet point specs now that allows you to say, these are the skills, this is the behaviors, these are the skills, here's how we're going to measure them. And I mean, it's the same thing we all had problems with in person, but like the bias to they're like me and I understand them. And even little things like making assumptions about their experience. All of our jobs are online. We assume that things are universal. Their internet connection speed, the fact that they're 2 minutes late because they had dial-up issues, like, that should have nothing to do with the interview. That is a local market condition that you cannot control. I've spent the last 2 weeks previously in Kenya, and it was really interesting for me because we were in co-working spaces in the middle of Nairobi, and the power would go out at least 2 times a day. Very standard. The internet is always on the backup, so it doesn't go out, which is really weird. But if that was on an interview and they couldn't dial in for 2 minutes, you would put that against them often, based on the expectation in London that they're always going to have access to those things. That can't be an expectation. You need to take that stuff out of the process, and the only way to do that is to surface it. Otherwise, you're immediately biasing the process to the cultural inclusion as soon as you get on that phone call.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess from a candidate perspective, when it's all remote, it's a two-way assessment, right? A good interview should be a two-way assessment. Do you think it's possible for candidates to get a sense of, as easily get a sense of the company atmosphere, what this place might be like to work for? How have you addressed that challenge when recruiting remotely?
Yeah, that's difficult when there's not an office that you rock up to and walk through to get to the meeting room where the interview is going to take place. So it is a real challenge. I mean, we for the vast majority of our roles, there would be more than one person involved in they would have touch points with more than one, and normally it could be 3 or 4 different people at the agency. I think a lot of it is about making sure that your shop window reflects your culture. So whether it's your website and all your socials, is that truly reflective of what it's like to work there? It's they're not just there for potential clients or whatever. It's also potential team members as well. Obviously, we would talk about the culture on the and the values, and definitely values-based questions as part of the interview process as well. But yeah, it's definitely more difficult when you're not seeing the team.
Do you ever give people an opportunity to almost have a peer-to-peer conversation as part of an assessment process? Or just interested.
Haven't done that, but I'm going to make a note. I love the idea.
I mean, we do. We have, basically we end up with 2 culture stages, because one is screening them, one is them screening us, basically, and meeting the team. And that stuff that would quite organically happen in an office where you'd like have them sit down with somebody for coffee and all those sorts of things, you have to manufacture. Like, that's sort of the final stage of our interview, where for all of our technical roles, it's a pairing exercise and then meet the team, basically. And we just frame it as that of, here's the people you'd be working with, ask questions, get to know each other, because that's part that would just happen in an office and doesn't just happen. So you have to be really conscious about manufacturing the people time.
It's a really good idea. And I think also just it's setting the stage, for the interview process can be very reflective of your culture as well. How flexible you are with times for the interview, that reflects how flexible you are, making it really, really clear what's going to happen in the interview, what you need for the interview. You need a working webcam, and just making it everything as clear as possible. Because I suppose if you go to an interview and the company's been super rigid about the interview time and they haven't made it clear what you need to bring to the interview, that's not going to make you feel good about potentially working there.
Yeah.
The conversation that's running through my mind is actually one we had in the diversity, equity and inclusion webinar that we ran a few weeks ago. And I guess some of those risks associated with those meet the team types of conversations where you put with a diversity hat on, can that create a moment that is quite off-putting for somebody who maybe doesn't see themselves reflected in that team? And but then it's really important you do need to be able to give candidates that opportunity to experience what the team are like that they might be joining. So it's just, I think some of those things can come a bit in tension. There isn't a really easy right answer to any of this stuff. It's sort of experimenting, finding out what.
Yep.
We certainly don't have all the answers, that's for sure.
No.
I guess the elephant in the room that we haven't touched on really is hybrid. And I guess start with a simple question. How important do you think, if you are a hybrid organization, so you're working some of the time at least in an office or in an in-person environment, that is reflected in the recruitment process? Wendy?
I think ideally yes, right. And I think it'll depend on the location of where the person's being hired, and if you have hybrid opportunities there. For our company, there are a lot of the places where we have people where there's no hybrid opportunity, or very, very rare. But if, for example, we're hiring a role in London, even though none of our recruitment team actually work in London, we have plenty of other people who do. And as long as, like Michelle was saying, the process is consistent for every candidate, I think having that opportunity to meet face to face, as well as doing some of it remotely, to give them that experience, but also for our team to experience working with people in that context. I think it's important to try and reflect it if you can. I mean, like Michelle was saying, we tend to use sort of shared co-worker spaces in the locations where we do that. Rather, we don't have our own office anymore. So in lots of places where we have hubs, there is that opportunity.
I'm interested, you describe that as where there is the opportunity for them to come into an office space, as opposed to where there is the expectation for somebody to come into an office space. And I know, Michelle, you've got very strong views on hybrid.
I was gonna say, that's the problem with hybrid, is it's everything. Like, depends what you mean by hybrid.
Yeah. So maybe can you expand a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interview process should reflect whatever your reality is. And if hybrid to you means 2 days a week you're in this London office, of course the interview should reflect that, and one of the stages should be in the office. If hybrid means some of us work in an office, some of us work remote, then you need to be flexible to what the candidate is, right? That some of us in the office, some of us remote is the bit I don't really like, because I think then you are creating two different cultures. It's a different webinar for another day. But I think that's the challenge, is it should reflect what the reality of the expectation of the job is.
Yeah.
And if that's, you'll be in the office, here's where our office is, then you fly them to it, you drive them to it, whatever that is. Because if they can't get there, then it's also not going to work, right? So,
yeah, good point.
Back on the subject of remote then, and I think, all these things are all a spectrum, right? We talked about remote first, and where we started actually when we were just having a pre-call on this was we started in the value of in-person time spent with the team. So I don't think at any stage we're trying to advocate for, never sit in a room with any of your colleagues, but we will come on to some of the company culture stuff towards the end of this. So just thinking about recruiting into a remote first world, are there particular attributes that you think are required for candidates to be successful in that kind of a workplace? And if there are, how do you try to assess for those in the recruitment process? Because we've talked about some of the things like internet connectivity and things that are not within a candidate's control. So how do we not bias ourselves against those? But so two-part question: what are the attributes? Are there attributes that you think, skills and attributes that people need to succeed in a remote first world, and how do you assess for those? Wendy.
The assessive part is really difficult. I mean, I think there are attributes. I think you have to have a certain amount of self-discipline to be able to succeed. You have to be able to spend long periods of time on your own, and that's difficult. I think for we noticed a big difference in the pandemic for our people who had chosen to work out of the office to then having to work from home. Very much more difficult, I think, for those team members than for the people who already work from home. So that bit was kind of normal anyway. So those people who get their energy from other people, it's tricky. So I think a lot of it is really about the self-discipline, but also just the attributes that you need to succeed in any workplace. I think resilience is a big one as well, and I think communicating online, we all know can be so easily misunderstood if it's it's a ping or if it's an email, but even a video call, you can cover up a lot more than you can in a face-to-face conversation. So in terms of specifically assessing for those remotely, it is just difficult. I don't think I really have anything valuable to say on that. Michelle, I don't know if
Yeah, I mean, similar. I think the other thing we've sort of talked around and said a lot in terms of how we handle the candidates is communication, right? In the absence of information, everybody makes assumptions, and that's human nature. And the one thing I think all learned in 2020 was how much communication and transparency, just being really open about information, made everybody a little calmer, right? So that becomes part of your company culture. We've adapted our values and our behaviors and train on it and interview on it. And it's the same thing you would do for any other behavior. It's behavioral questions, like fairly, what would you do in this situation? The other thing we're really looking for is relationship building. How do you connect with other humans so that it isn't that like isolation at home alone and never talk to anyone, right? But that still sort of falls under that communication. Like, how do you work with everyone? How do you collaborate? How do you build relationships when you're not face to face? And we just ask a lot of those questions and have that conversation, especially for leadership roles and anybody who's managing teams or working in teams.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, there's a wonderful training partner that we work with called Rachel Boothroyd, and one of the things that she says to us, I've just suddenly got an echo, is there are no surprises in the training room. And I suppose that's the same thing, there are no surprises in the interview or the recruitment process. What you see from that person is what you're going to get, most likely, when there might be a more suited and booted version that you're going to get. But intrinsically, humans are humans.
Yep.
And unless they're incredible actors, I think you will kind of get a decent sense of how they'll work with your team throughout that process. And
I think that's a really interesting point, and something we've realized, also recently in some of our interviews, is multiple stages. I think you will get a much better sense of a person in an hour face-to-face and how they interact with the office manager, receptionist, whatever it is. Like, all of those things are different trigger points, and you can get the real human. Having maybe an extra stage or just an additional stage, like it's very hard to do 2 interviews because you're going to get the formal version. You're not going to get the real, who is this person going to be day to day, until they relax a bit, until you're talking a little bit more culturally. And we often find in that final interview stage I was describing of meet the team and stuff, that's where you're like, oh, is that who you really are? Because that's not what we expected, because you get the very formal version when they're in front of the CEO and stuff. So I find that really interesting, is how people relax through the process and you get a little bit more of the reality. Like, this is the person you're going to see in week 2, 3 of the role. So like sticking to those things, not being like, oh, we love them after 1 or 2 stages. And there's a sense of, it's easier, but it's not in the long run.
And I mean, this probably leads us nicely into sort of the last chunky part of our conversation, which is we all know that recruitment doesn't end when you've offered a job to somebody or they've even accepted the job. You know, there's the whole translating all those good things that you think you've discovered about each other during the assessment process into them doing a brilliant job and enjoying being part of the company, loosely described as onboarding, and go from what is it, point of offer through to, well, pick your end date. So this is a big topic. But when you have stuck maybe to your principles of everything on Zoom through the hiring process or everything remote, how would you help people to feel like they belong quickly when they actually start in the role? What are some of the things that you've done in your organizations to really generate that sense of belonging early on when we're working in a remote world? Wendy.
So yes, obviously it's a whole new layer of complexity when you're doing it remotely. I think one of the things that we've learned is that short chunks is best. Not like one big long induction presentation and then off they go and expected to get on with it. So, and a mixture of delivery methods as well. So there might be, conversations or live presentations or a video or a document with a questionnaire, but just all short chunks, short meetings with key people over a period of weeks rather than trying to cram everything into week one. One of the things that we do early on is tell people about, we've got water cooler chat spaces for various things, whether it be kind of travel or music or pets is a kind of our most popular one. So we make sure we sort of introduce people to that stuff early on as well, so they can get to know people that they don't necessarily work with. But when they can't just kind of put their head over their monitor and look at someone and where would they lose again? Having everything remote is complicated for people. And I kind of think of the onboarding period, you were saying, pick your end date. I think 6 to 9 months, maybe. I think there's a 3 months seems to be a time frame that people think of more often, but I think it's much longer than that. So there's so much to remember and so much to absorb.
Yeah, and I think it can really depend on industry. So the reason that we've often at the Pioneers talked about 3 months is because we've done a lot of work in hospitality, and 90 days just happens to be a number they measure in terms of turnover of their team. But the reason they measure that is because they do find if you can get people through that first period, which can be incredibly intense in that kind of industry, it means people are far more likely to stay and actually pursue careers in the industry. So yeah, it depends, doesn't it, on the
it does. And for some people it might be 3 weeks and they're in there and they're settled and everything's great,
yeah.
I think it's just not expecting people to be an expert on it all.
Absolutely. Michelle, are there particular things that you do at We Farm that you think generate an early sense of belonging for remote employees?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Wendy talked about, we've created a lot of self-serve content and stuff for onboarding as well. I think being able to move at your own pace instead of you can see when they're getting uncomfortable in person. You can't see when they're doing it over video calls and stuff. So create stuff that they can go through at their own pace. And connect as humans, like you were saying, water cooler, and over communicate all of those things, right? They don't know that they're there. We have water cooler channels, we have pets channels, but people often go, oh, I didn't know that was there, like 6 weeks later, even some of the main channels that they should be in for business. So we got really clear on what is all that stuff you would hear in an office, all that stuff that Joe would nudge you and say, have you been in this meeting or have you talked to this person? Like, you don't know that. They're not going to get that naturally. So what are the social norms? What are the expectations of how and when we speak to each other? When do you use email? When do you use Slack? How do you build those into your culture onboarding and just have a lot of really honest conversations? And I think people are afraid to, like, I've heard it referred to as treating people like children. Like, they should know these things, but especially in a global organization, everybody's coming from different backgrounds. They all have different expectations of what norm is. So what is what is it at We Farm? What is it that we expect of you? And I was saying earlier, we changed the values. We also wrote really clear behaviors and examples of what that looks like. And here's how that's lived. And we reinforce that at all hands and all of those things so that they can see what it looks like in others the way you would in an office, but you don't get that necessarily over Slack. You don't get that context in a 100-word post. Like, so how do you create those connections? And connecting as human beings, we are social creatures. We lose trust when we don't know each other as people. I want to know about when you just get down to business on a Zoom call and jump straight in. That's not helpful. So we've built in 5-minute sort of what's going on in your world. How are you into the beginning of calls so that you're connecting with the human, virtual coffees, buddy systems, Zoom events. And then for us, that also means investing in time together. So we will do one annual get everybody in the same place from wherever they are and have a very large travel budget for the times in between. Like I said, I was in Kenya. We have 25 people in Kenya. That meant driving around a lot. Like, but it is important for me to be present and be able to have a meal and share food with people. And that's really important to the human connection, because I've had better conversations this week with people over Slack because I know them a bit. I know how to, like, what's their style and what's their approach. That's very much what we mean when we say remote first. We all work from home. I'm clearly in the corner of my flat, but there's still that need to connect as human beings. And you can do that in the first few weeks over Zoom. Ideally, within the first few months, they meet somebody face to face, whether that's across town or across the world, depending on what that looks like.
Yeah, and it's so exciting to be at the end of the pandemic where we can all start doing that again, because it was a real loss. I mean, the connections, just are deeper, when you meet someone face to face, and it does maintain, it needs topping up every now and then, right? But it does seem to maintain for a few months.
Yeah, it's like this bank that you need to pay into regularly, isn't it? We just need that time together. I was going to come to that at the end, but that's great.
I mean, last week I met people I was just going to say, like, last week I met people I've worked with every single day for 1.5 years, and it was the first time we sat together, and it's nice that it didn't feel weird, but I was surprised how nice it was to just be in the same space, right? I joined in November 2020. It was 6 months before I met the CEO who lives on the other side of town.
So my immediate follow-up question to that point then is, obviously the last couple of years we've been prohibited from spending any time in person. I'm interested, have you got to the point yet where, Michelle, you mentioned ideally as early as possible, people get an opportunity to at least spend some time face-to-face with some colleagues. Are you at the stage where you're thinking about almost saying within the first month, we will make sure, and do you anticipate moving in that direction at all? Or that's Michelle.
I mean, for us, no, because we are remote first and because we're hiring people all over the place, that is not practical. You also need to set the expectation that it is remote. So how do you build networks and connections virtually? The in-person is a bonus. It shouldn't be the expectation. So it will be somewhere within their first year, because we'll all get together once a year. Depending on the role, it may be before that, but it will be for a business reason. The social bit's the bonus.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe Wendy, the same question then. Have you talked about that, the social element?
Not really, very, again, similar reasons, just because we are so dispersed and we've got whole countries where there might only be one person who might work 10 hours a week or so, so, but where it is possible, we haven't put a specific time frame on it, but if somebody is in London or Valencia, or, we've got various places where we've just grown hubs organically, then the likelihood is they'll get together with someone fairly quickly. But we haven't put a time frame on it. And we do encourage people to share when they're traveling as well, that have nothing to do with work, because we will, we've got a kind of coffee and cake budget where we say, if you're going somewhere where there's someone else from the social element, please get together and have lunch on us or whatever. And so that we can, for the most part, people are getting to meet somebody. But it's not formalized for all of our countries.
Yeah. So the other follow-up question I had was around automation of a lot of this. So there's particularly when working remotely, there's lots of those, it's a build on self-directed onboarding materials and those kinds of things, and maybe nudging particular coffee meeting, online coffee meetings and those. And so there's loads of potential for automating elements of the onboarding process that actually help build those connections and make that, rather than relying on, say, the hiring manager to, or the line manager to sort of own all of that. Do either of you make use of those sorts of tools?
Not really.
So it's a high touch, personalized.
Yeah.
Somebody looks after them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Same in
ours is still quite personalized. It's very high touch. There's a couple like minor ones, like we use, it's literally called Water Cooler on Slack, and it pairs people every week to have coffee catch-ups. There's donut, there's various versions of it, but Water Cooler is the one that's free. So you put everybody in one channel and it just pairs you every week, and we encourage people to have that half-hour chat and get to know somebody, and just talk about yourselves, not about work. Never quite works that way, at least for mine, but anyways. And then a lot of the onboarding workflow, we moved to a new HR system last year. So it automates a lot of the triggers of watch this video, talk to this person. So it's there reminding them to have those conversations, but there's definitely a human following up. It's still pretty high touch in terms of content. Yeah, interesting.
It's gone. That prompted a question. But it's escaped my mind. Never mind. And I guess, so we talked a lot about how you create a sense of belonging within the onboarding process, how you make that happen quickly. Because the other side of that is, and how do you get people up to speed quickly to be able to actually do their job? So not the social stuff, not but like get them to a position where they feel like they can perform and do well. Are there things that you deliberately have implemented to help with that?
I think some of it's just information that they're sent as part of that process. So one of the things about working remotely is that you're probably going to be using a bunch of systems that you haven't used before, or they might look similar to ones you've used before. So we have lots of kind of bite-sized training videos on that kind of thing. But then once people are through that kind of central stuff and they're in their department and they'll get training from their managers, or if they go to work on a particular client Facebook page or something, then there's bespoke training from various people. So again, it's high touch and it's human for the most part.
Yeah, interesting.
Some things there'll be assessments, but and monitoring.
Michelle, same for you. Is there more that you do that helps with, particularly with the job role, as opposed to the person or the
I mean, people are hired for their skills. I think the bit that's hard, they're successful or not based on their ability to communicate and build those relationships. So that's the bit we focus on, because you have the technical skills, you have the operational skills, whatever the role is you were hired for, that's why you're here. What you don't have is the context of our business. So it's in that onboarding workflow, but it's a lot of the watch this all hands because we talked about our new pitch, watch this video because it talks about our farmers, like connecting them to what we're doing. And then a lot of the sessions are designed to be like, this is the person you go to for this. This is what marketing does. This is what this tech person does. So our sessions, or the live sessions, are designed to build those interactions, because that's what's going to make people successful, is knowing who to go to, knowing who to ask, not necessarily the technical skill, because that's why they're here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Leads me maybe onto, I'm going to make this the last question of the session. So we talked about hiring into these remote cultures, or into remote first businesses. What's maybe one top tip for creating remote teams that really thrive? If you had to try and synthesize into one, like, if one thing that you would recommend to somebody else who's trying to make a remote first business work, and particularly work for the teams that they're employing, what would be that one piece of advice that you'd share with them?
pick on one
Go
of
ahead,
us.
Wendy.
Gosh, I mean, I think it's sort of echoing a lot of what Michelle said about communication and human interaction. It's getting people together synchronously. You know, when we work in different time zones, a lot of what happens is asynchronous. You know, because I'll send an email and the person in California will pick it up in the morning. You know, but it's creating those in the same place at the same time opportunities that are not necessarily about work. So we did throughout the pandemic, actually, it was really important. We started having a daily briefing with the CEO, myself, and just anyone who wanted to come to talk about anything that they wanted to talk about. And we found that as people kind of got used to being in lockdown, those sessions became less important for people, but to start with, they were super important for people. So I think it's the getting people together to talk about stuff that's not work will be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think similar. It's communication, right? You need to be really conscious of how you communicate and how you build those network effects. The things that we all took for granted in offices, the way they were designed, the way people interacted, the way there were those little groups that would tell more and those sorts of things, those are all happening, but you have to be really conscious about how you design them in a business. If it's done right, it will look super organic and they'll just feel like part of the team, but communication is harder. You need to spend more time being deliberate about it. And I think that's what we all did wrong when we were forced to go remote early in the pandemic, is we just tried to replicate the office, and then everybody stopped trusting each other. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't have those networks. So be really conscious about how you create them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if we were still in the 90s, I'd be saying to create an equivalent of where people go for a cigarette outside.
Yeah. You know? We tried that. We all had I had open Zooms at lunchtime. Nobody went. That was the reason none of us ever want to do a quiz again in our lives. Like those things.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
We just tried to replace what happened in an office and that's not the same. You have to design, and that's why I really believe in remote first. You're designing for remote as the default. Everything else is a bonus. And that's often where I think hybrid gets lost, is you need to design it consciously to create the right outcome and have people interact in the ways you intend. Otherwise, all kinds of unintentional things will happen in a remote or hybrid environment.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking about remote isn't just people don't commute. Like it's not it's not that you've just taken the commute element out and you've given people that time back and time to be flexible. It is a very different way of working, and I think that's a really good message to end the conversation on. And I think a lot of the things that we've talked about this afternoon have hopefully revealed some of those tactics that you can deploy that work in a remote first world. These are the things that matter the most. So thank you both so much for your contributions. I've really enjoyed not just this conversation, but the last 4 conversations that we've had as well on this subject of recruiting for in a rapidly scaling environment, and some of the challenges and opportunities that presents. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here and for listening to what we've had to say. Hopefully it's been a useful session.
Thank you.
Thank you.